I don't see too many more people coming on, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And of course, here comes some more people. My name is Jim Ketchum. I'm a retired pastor, and I serve on the executive committee of the State Council of Churches. Joining me today is Susan Lerner, who has been executive director of Common Cause New York for quite some time, and one of the leading experts on reform when it comes to voting rights, campaign finance reform, etc. So today, of course, we will be talking about voting rights, and you'll notice if you have checked out the State Council website, we have some general principles to start with. I'm just going to read 4 of those real quick for you. First of all, we oppose all attempts to hinder voter registration and voting, especially when those restrictions happen to fall most heavily on the poor, the elderly, the young, and people of color. We oppose any further restrictions on registration and voting, as there's no indication of any election fraud, and plenty of evidence that would-be voters have been discouraged, disqualified, or turned away. We support measures to make it easier to register to vote, easier to find a polling place nearby, and easier to cast an absentee ballot or to vote early. And finally, to ensure that all are heard, not just the wealthiest among us, we support efforts to limit the influence of large campaign donors by limiting the size of contributions allowed and implementing public financing of campaigns, which would reward candidates for seeking small donations from a larger group of people. These, of course, are just some of the issues that we're looking at. Those are the, as I said, the overarching principles we're working with. Susan, I know one of your Common Cause's big interests is the Constitutional Convention under
Yes.
Article 5. Why don't you explain what a con is and why it's a negative?
Okay, so one of our primary issues across the country, this isn't only an issue in New York, is a attempt to educate policymakers and the engaged public about an ongoing and very real threat that's happening under the radar. And that is a concerted effort by the extreme right wing to radically change our constitutional system by actually directly changing the Constitution. You may be aware that Article 5 of the federal Constitution provides 2 ways in which the Constitution can be changed. One, amending the Constitution by passing the amendment through Congress and then having it approved by the states. And that is the way in which the Constitution has been amended more than 20 times. But Article 5 of the Constitution also provides for a constitutional convention if 2/3 of the states call for a constitutional convention. And the far right wing has grabbed this particular approach, which fits in a populist framework of the elites aren't listening to the people and therefore we have to grab power back. It started as a move to hobble the federal government with a balanced budget amendment. Because as you know, the federal government uses its ability to borrow money to basically address fiscal and budgetary economic emergencies and help to regulate the economy, which after all is not self-sustaining and should be all about helping people. And so that's the governmental level which can respond to changes in the finances of the country by borrowing money, by printing money. The states are almost all restricted, requiring a balanced budget every single year, which, as we know, has provided some real fiscal stress at the state level, which almost always falls on the poorest and least capable to handle the diminution in state resources. So it started as a balanced budget amendment push, but now it's been expanded. There's a new organization called Conference of the States, very glitzy website, pushing out, appearing on far right-wing talk radio, telling people that the way to take our government back is to require a constitutional convention and open the entire Constitution to be rewritten. As you can imagine, what they want to get rid of, they're very open. They want to get rid of basically the Bill of Rights, except for the Second Amendment. They want to basically go back to the Articles of Confederation and eviscerate the federal government so that everything is under the control of the states. They have managed to get 29 states. We have blocked them in many states. In some states, we've been able to reverse the resolution to call for a constitutional convention. In other states, we've blocked it. They're at 29, and they realize they're going to have a very difficult time getting to 34. So what they've done is they've looked around at the records, and they found that there are a number of states which have constitutional resolutions at various times. And New York happens to be one. We have a constitutional resolution from 1789, which technically was never repealed. We have one from the 30s that deals with prohibition. We have one from the 70s, which deals with education. And what we think would happen is that if the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives again, they would then appeal to the far right-wing leadership of that reconfigured House of Representatives and say, we have enough people, we have enough states, here's New York, here's several others, that gets us to 34, bring a constitutional convention. And it would be a runaway train. The writing of Nancy McLean, a history professor at Duke University, her book, Democracy in Chains, really addresses this threat. She's been wonderful in working with us in some legislative meetings, and we are posed to introduce constitutional resolutions or resolutions in both houses of the legislature, which would repeal these three aged calls for constitutional conventions, because once the Republicans start the runaway train, it's going to be too late to say that what they're doing is invalid. We need to take care of it now. We successfully repealed outstanding calls for a constitutional convention in New Jersey in December, and we're hoping within the next 1 to 2 months that we will just very quickly, quietly introduce these resolutions and pass them, taking these aged calls off the books and doing everything we can to thwart this far right-wing takeover attempt.
Susan, has an Article 5 convention ever been called before?
Never. And there's nothing in the Constitution to outline what it is. It just says call a convention. So it is the wide open Wild West. And, unfortunately, the polling figures show over and over and over again that the far right wing supporters are very activated and many other Americans are despairing. So we can easily see what would happen in this situation. And Nancy McLean, in her book, Democracy in Chains, points to what happened with the Chile Constitution, which basically hobbled the federal government and set an oligarchy in place. And it has taken them over 30 years to unwind what was done very deliberately in back in the latter part of the 20th century. And the same theories are informing the people who are calling for a constitutional convention here in the US. So we know how really dreadful it can be, and there's no reason why we shouldn't thwart it.
One of the things that worries me is that there are simply no rules whatsoever in the Constitution. And already I've been hearing arguments about the smaller states go, well, of course, there'll be one vote per state. And the larger states are going, wait a minute, we've got 5 times as many people in our state. So we we get more votes, and there's no guidance, and the courts will probably not touch this.
No, not at all. So with a situation where unfortunately we have far right-wing control of too many states around the country, which we are seeing over and over again in the democracy space, which has resulted in all sorts of voter suppression, we can well imagine what they would demand out of this convention. It would be a runaway train with no rules and no limits, and we could wake up and find that they had structured a constitution, as I said, that's like the Articles of Confederation, where our rights are not protected and the federal government has basically been kneecapped.
Right. And would you agree there's no way to limit a constitutional convention to a single point, a single topic?
No, not at all. Not at all. Once the gate is opened, everything can be addressed. And we point to what happened with the Constitutional Convention in 1789. It was supposed to be a very limited convention to reframe the Articles of Confederation. And once it was in place, they completely rewrote, now luckily in a very good way, the basis for the federal government. But remember, the Bill of Rights had to be adopted later. So, without any clear guidance, this is not the political time to open up our federal constitution. Let me put it that way. It needs reframing. There are definitely things that we want to see changed, but through an amendment process, not through a constitutional convention. So, yeah.
Sumati, I see your hand is up, Sumati.
Yes, I keep up with much of the stuff. I'm also a member of Common Cause, New York and National, but I'm shocked at this. I didn't know a thing about it. And I suspect that the vast majority of people don't know about this. I just want to clarify one point you made. 29, you said, are on board, having adopted the idea of convening. And what I thought I heard you say, and this is what I want clarification on, is that New York has some past calls that are on the books, which they could say, they're trying to say, well, New York has done this in 17 whenever it did it.
That's right. And it still applies because it was never repealed. Now, we know that argument really does not hold water. But if you've got far right-wing activists talking to a far right-wing Congress, we know we're looking at the lies that they are putting out on so many different topics. The fact that there's no legal basis that is really valid for this argument will not constrain them. They will grab hold of any argument that they think they can get away with. So we need to absolutely undercut it. Common Cause has sent out information about this to our list. But yes, I agree. It is an issue which many people do not understand. And that's why I really recommend Nancy's book, because it really helps you understand the totality. And actually, she's working on a new book that's focused on very specifically this issue of the Constitutional Convention.
So 5 more states would be needed for it to get to 34, right? Is what
That's correct. That's correct. And there's no time to waste. We've repealed it, I think, in Maryland. We've repealed it or stopped it in Colorado and New Mexico. And we've had good success at thwarting their efforts. But New York is unfortunately always an embarrassment on these issues, and we need to remove New York. Nancy's book is Democracy in Chains, and I cannot recommend it enough.
So what is it that you have in mind that can be done about this? How do we get on board?
So what we are doing, we are working with both the Assembly and the Senate, and within the next month, I expect that there will be resolutions that are introduced in both houses, because all it requires is a resolution to repeal the 3 outstanding requests. To make it clear, these are not on the books anymore. Don't point to these as valid. We disavow these, we repeal them. Do not count New York towards your total, period.
Okay. Do we have any other issues of concern for Common Cause? Wait, Mark, I see your
Mark
hand
has
up.
a question.
Yes, yeah. First, Susan, thanks so much for bringing this to our attention and for moving on it. And I guess I would say let Peter know or anyone that you can when you need our help. I mean, it seems like it's a no-brainer. I don't think it's just a matter of inaction is our only enemy here, because I think
That's right.
certainly the Assembly and the Senate will move on this. So thank you for taking this lead.
Yeah, and the
Amazing.
council has signed on to a letter
Okay.
because we want to be sure that both houses understand how important this is. What I found when we started talking to some of the Assembly members is that they have gotten communications from supporters of this idea and from grassroots who are hearing it on the radio. So it's out there. It's just not on our radar. It's in the far right wing echo chamber, and it is getting louder. So this is something which I expect that we will move within the next 2 months, if not sooner.
But I do have, Jim, I do have another question. So interestingly, at some recent federal debate about, I forget what it was about, but about voting rights, I guess it's about voting rights. And some Republicans said, look, even New York State just didn't allow the voters to, same-day registration, whatever, because we know that there wasn't a big push on it on our side. And there was basically people weren't aware of it and were afraid of passing any change to any resolution. But is there an effort to reintroduce that? Because clearly, if you asked everyone in New York State, you'd have a majority of people in favor if they knew what they were being asked to do.
Yeah. So I
I'm gonna
definitely want to talk about that, but I think,
Can we hold off on that? Because we're going to
Yeah.
have another whole discussion, another whole topic about that very question.
Oh, good.
So
Okay.
We'll
Thank
answer
you.
that. But I wanted to get to Catherine Darcy. She has had her hand up for a while.
Okay, if this isn't time for this question, you could tell me this isn't time for the question. I recently moved here from Oklahoma, and I was very happy to come to New York. I was born in New York State, actually. Very happy to come to such a progressive state. But when the voter rights discussions were going on and on and on television, on the news and stuff, I'd see them post a map of the states, and they were always in red, where the voting rights were left something, if not a lot, to be desired. And most of them were in the southern states. But New York was always in red. Could you just comment on that if this isn't the right time?
I think we're going to come back to under voting rights. We're going to talk a lot about the attempts to limit the ballot, access to the ballot.
but Catherine, you raise a really, really valid point that New York is a black eye on voting rights. And Mark, you're correct. I'm sorry to say, 10 pages of quotes from the floor vote in the US Senate on the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, where the Republicans had a nauseatingly repeated talking point about New York and how retrogressive it is. So yes, we are definitely working to remove New York from the embarrassing column.
Let's spend just a couple minutes on redistricting and reapportionment. We've all seen recently the debacle that was basically planned with New York's redistricting effort.
So, it's really a pretty sad story, and there's no satisfaction to being the Cassandra of redistricting, which is sort of my role. Since 2014, or even earlier, I've been saying that what was being proposed by the then Cuomo administration was bound to fail, was designed to fail. It was not. We went to the courts to keep the constitutional amendment that was on the ballot in 2014 from describing the commission as independent, and the judge agreed with us. It was clearly not an independent commission. So what this does is really underline the fact that we need to have real redistricting reform. And there are models which clearly work at both the local and the state level that are working right now. California has a truly independent, citizen-led redistricting commission. It has gone through its second cycle. And the maps that they drew for the first time in almost forever are not the subject of litigation. Michigan's voters put a measure on the ballot in 2018 to set up a citizen-led redistricting commission. They have successfully gone through their redistricting process. They've come out with a set of maps which have offended both Democrats and Republicans, which tell you that they're straight down the middle. So we consider that redistricting process to be a success. And I want to point out to you that Syracuse is for the first time using a citizen-led redistricting process for redrawing the maps for their common council. There are 15 diverse citizens of Syracuse who are taking comments and holding hearings and holding public discussions about what the map should look like for their common council, a map which has been unchanged for 20 years. So if any of you are in the Syracuse Onondaga area, I invite you to have your congregations take a look at that process and, if appropriate, urge people to get involved. And we're watching that and helping that commission because we think it is a perfect example of how it works. We are talking with our partners, particularly in the civil rights community, about holding a citizens hearing on redistricting, because we know that the legislature is not going to discuss all of the failures that we have been burdened with in the redistricting process this cycle. And we are going to have to refocus them and the public on the fact that there is a better way to do this and start putting pressure on them while the debacle, if I can call it that, is fresh in everybody's minds. There's litigation going on. A group of Republicans have filed a lawsuit upstate challenging the maps. They're asking for all of the documents which relate to the legislature's redistricting process. I think they're going to find that there are relatively few. There's a real open question as to whether that lawsuit will result in anything productive. The new redistricting provisions of the Constitution, which failed so spectacularly with the commission, actually have a set of criteria which is more or less workable, certainly better than what we had before, but there's an open question as to how they will be implemented, what a court would do with them, and whether the Court of Appeals, which frankly is relatively political in our state, will override prior precedent in our state courts to say that redistricting is a political process that is in the hands of the legislature and basically punt at looking at these maps. We just don't know. So stay tuned to see what happens with the current maps. They are moderately gerrymandered for Congress. They could have been more aggressive. They also could have been more neutral. They kind of took a middle road. It's a map that flips 4 districts from D to R. There are several maps that could have been passed that we've seen that would have flipped 5 districts. The demographics seem to support flipping 3 districts. So between 3 and 5, they picked 4, they went down the middle. So it really is an open question as to what a court would decide.
So Marty.
Yes, I know that there are some people in New York City that are talking about how the redistricting that's been done does not fairly represent communities of color. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So there is a consortium of civil rights groups that have come up with a unity map for New York City. The limitation there is that they are focused on New York City. The map for Congress and the map for the state Senate are the ones that people are looking at. Initial reactions are that they were pretty carefully gerrymandered, in that they created districts which are, if not majority, minority voters, very close there. And that the community that really got most shafted in the redistricting was the South Asian community. We were shocked by the Long Island districts on the Senate map, because they continued a 40-year pattern of cracking the minority, the people of color districts in the Hempstead and Elmwood areas in a way that we thought was really, really shocking. But I think, you know, a Voting Rights Act case requires some fairly sophisticated analysis regarding polarized voting. And I know that the groups are looking to see whether they feel that they have a strong enough case. Because as I said, the maps are pretty cleverly drawn. They aren't shockingly bad for the Black community, for the Latino community, for the East Asian community. They do completely ignore the South Asian community, more or less. And so those discussions are ongoing, and I don't yet know whether they've made a final determination of whether they feel they need to move in court on the maps or not.
It's important to remember that New York State is always going, we can't do that, we can't do that, we can't do that, this is terrible, but other states are doing exactly these reforms we're talking about. It's not that it's not a model out there, or models, plural.
So, but the only place I'm aware of where a legislature has taken the pen out of its own hands is Syracuse. It's the Common Council that put the measure on the ballot to give citizens control of redistricting. Every place else, it's the citizens who had to put a measure on the ballot. So in California and Michigan, they were initiatives. In Austin, Texas, they were initiatives. We don't have that process. Our problem is we have to convince the legislature to give up their power to help themselves by drawing their own lines. And that's our challenge. And that's why we need to build strong public support for a real solution.
Yep. Let's move on to what everybody seems to want to talk about, the various ways we can look at voting rights. I have on my list first same day registration and absentee voting.
Yes. So let me talk a little bit about what happened in November, okay? Which is a really shocking lack of support, lack of attention to the pro-voter proposals which were on the ballot. And, you know, Ronnie indicates, do you have a question about redistricting or the voting rights aspect?
I don't think it's a question where you're going right now, but I do have a question. So let you finish up with your thought, and then you could circle back to me.
Okay, great. And you know, that it really, those of us in the Let New York Vote Coalition realized what was happening, and we tried to build support for the two proposals that were on the ballot. And I was literally laughed at by funders who said that why would we waste money on New York? We have bigger fish to fry in North Carolina and in Georgia, and we need to spend our money in other places. New York is reliably blue, and you don't have anything to worry about. And I was standing there with polling that said that these things were going down, and I got no traction. And the people, the legislators gave us no help. Now, the legislature made a mistake in putting these on the ballot in 21. We believe that a lot of the problems were due to the fact that there was not only no support, but they were on the ballot at the wrong time. Our analysis shows that basically the voters who would support this just didn't turn out because there was nothing on the ballot for them. So there will be a move to put these back on the ballot. They'll go back on the ballot in 24, and you'll be hearing from us once we have the improved language to go back on the ballot and the public education campaign to support it. Because those of you who are outside of New York City know that the billionaire who spent money to defeat these proposals on the ballot is spending money to make this an election issue for legislators and the governor. And we really are not in a position to allow this misinformation about voting rights and election reform to be continued to go out uncountered without arming our folks with the correct information about why protecting voting rights is important all across the country. And that, we need to pass these measures here in New York that benefit all voters, as well as, working on the other priorities that we have to really, deal with the fact that New York has been retrogressive in its approach to voting rights and election reform, and to take New York out of that red map and put it back where people think it already is, which is a progressive position that ensures access to the ballot for all New Yorkers, not just the well-educated who can jump through all of the hoops and obstacles and barriers that we put in the way of people being able to access the ballot. The priorities which have been outlined are really important ones. Without a doubt, moving the voter registration deadline, extending the no excuse absentee voting definition of illness, which has all been signed by the governor, are all really important, and we will be restarting the process of the constitutional amendments, but not until we have agreement on how better to describe them on the ballot.
Yeah.
Right?
That was very
and
confusing
so
language. Go
It
ahead,
was
Ronnie.
very confusing language. I'm working on a bill which would require that anything that goes on the ballot has to be in plain language and no more complex than an 8th grade reading level. But we're also raising money to do specific messaging to lock in how we describe what these reforms do in clear, persuasive language and get the legislature to put clear language on the ballot. If you look at what happened in November, there was a huge drop off in terms of voting for the proposals. The one that passed and got more votes where people could understand was the clean air and clean water proposal, because you read it and you said, of course, I understand what this is and I like it. So we need the same level of clarity in terms of the election reforms that we know are working successfully. Catherine, I mean, it was really incredible. One of the senators from Oklahoma got up and bragged that Oklahoma has no fault absentee voting. And it was great for Oklahomans, but apparently New Yorkers don't want it. So this is, got to stop. We have to address this, no question about it. But, we have other priorities, which I think are super important as well as we move, kind of what we think of as the baseline reforms. There are some important bills, which, Jim, I hope we get to talk about in the remaining time.
Yep. Yep. We've got a bunch of bills we can talk about, but I want to pick up Ronnie's question first.
Okay, so my question is this, and of course, I always come from a criminal justice angle. So you have men and women who are incarcerated, whose bodies are being counted as constituents of districts. Catskill is heavy with the 3 facilities, Green, Coxsackie, Hill.
Right.
Their bodies are being counted. However, these men and women can't vote, but they're part
Two
of
things.
that consensus in those areas. So when we start talking about voting rights, I think, I can't remember what state it is, New Hampshire or Maine, but one of those states allows incarcerated individuals to vote while they are incarcerated. And I don't know what it looks like, if they're gonna look like being voting from the county in which they are from, or voting from the county in which they're in. But the voting rights for incarcerated individuals needs to be given. I don't want to use the word restored because I don't know if we ever had it.
We never had it. That's the problem. So two things. Number one, in terms of the census count for individuals who are incarcerated, we lost the battle to get the census to count those people correctly, which is in their place of last residence. But here in New York, for the state maps, okay, for the Assembly and the State Senate, those people are reallocated back to their place of last residence. So they're not counted, and you point out in Catskills, they're not counted towards state Senate or Assembly districts, okay? For the state legislature, we were unable to do that for the measure that passed in the last redistricting cycle was specific to the state maps. The proposal one, which failed in November, would have required that prison-based gerrymandering be barred for congressional maps as well. So we need to fix that for the congressional maps. And that's something that we are interested in doing. But one of the longstanding priorities for Common Cause New York and the Let New York Vote Coalition is the restoration of voting rights for incarcerated individuals. We're part of the Restore the Vote Coalition, and we work with groups across the state who represent the affected community, because Common Cause should not be calling the shots on this strategy. So Ronnie, we are totally with you, and work on literally a weekly basis with our coalition partners to educate the public about why this is so essential, and to talk with legislators about the need for this reform, which requires a constitutional amendment in virtually every state, because, as you know, the racism was continued in the 15th, 14th and 15th amendments. And this is just a part of the racism that's built into the system that we want to change. So yes, I totally agree. And I'm really excited to see that the attempt is part of the priorities for the legislative agenda for the Council of Churches.
Right, because just past it was some election going, I forget what it was, but we had issues with county jails because currently the law is if a person is not sentenced, but they're in county jail awaiting sentencing, yeah, they are still allowed to vote.
Correct.
And so we ran into some opposition in Rensselaer County Jail, Albany County Jail, and Schenectady County Jail. And we would not stop because I had people who I was working with in the jails constantly informing me on whether they got their voter registrations and then they was able to vote. So, but it was a fight. Like, and the thing is, you have these other type of jails like Columbia County and all these other facilities that do not and will not let their incarcerated individuals vote, even though they have the legal right to vote. That's what inmate service units should be doing. They should be giving out the voter registration and making sure they're all registered and then making sure they're voting, but they're not doing it. They're lump summing everyone. And ignorance is important to understand, because even as me, a formerly incarcerated person, I was under the impression, because I was told that I would never be able to vote again. It wasn't until I was at an AIDS walk here in Albany where I jokingly filled out a voter registration card, for voter registration. And when it came to me in the mail, I was scared. And I called them and I said, listen, I'm not supposed to have this. I was told that. And the lady explained to me then, as long as I'm not on community supervision, that I can vote. But the system, the prisons in phase 3, they were telling us that we could never vote. They never told us that we could vote again once we were off community supervision.
Yeah, I see.
There are bills which are designed to require docs to provide that information. But one of the reasons why it's so important that we're having these conversations is that the bills are not self-enforcing, right? We need to know what Docs is doing or not doing. And we also need to unite your coalition with the folks in the reform community who do voter registration, who can help amplify your voices and follow your lead and put pressure on the jails and provide additional volunteers to go in. We fight this fight every single goddamn year in New York City.
I'm gonna put
Where
my
we
email in
have-
the chat.
Yeah,
Yep.
please.
Yeah.
We have a cadre of volunteers who want to go in, and we have to fight Docs to get people into the jails, to be sure that people have registration forms, fill out the request for absentee ballots, and then follow through. So happy to work with you on this.
Chris Mogeson, who's a chaplain in Broome County, has just put in the chat a suggestion that we work with the chaplains on that. The New York State Council of Churches certifies chaplains for Docs. So there might be some ways we could make sure there was another voice in each, maybe several voices sometimes in each prison to help with that voter registration issue. I want to move on. We've only got 17 minutes left, but I want to make sure we let me briefly say that people saying that we can't do this because the registrars would be overwhelmed and we can't do this because it's too complicated. Nonsense. It's being done in other states as we speak, and they've handled it. Susan, I want to go back to land on campaign finance reform.
Yes. So absolutely exciting news that the Fair Elections Coalition, which built support for this issue over like a 10-year period, was successful in passing public financing for the state races here in New York State, and that system is going to go into effect in the next few years. And it is supposed to be up and running in 2024. And it basically would provide a matching fund system for the state races, and would definitely, I think, really help to diversify the field of candidates. The idea is many more community-backed candidates running for office for the legislature and ultimately for the statewide offices, who may not have a pipeline to wealthy donors, who would then be able to raise small dollar donations, which would be matched on a 8-to-1 basis. So that means if you give a candidate a $10 donation, it is worth $90 to them because they would get $8 for your $1. And that we have seen in New York City makes a really significant difference in encouraging people who are backed by the community, reflect the communities that they want to represent, be able to actually run and run successful campaigns. It really can change the face of a legislature. And it's a very exciting possibility.
Part of this also includes lowering the maximum limit that people can give, which is
that's
ridiculous.
Exactly right. Not as low as we would like, but it is a beginning. And what I want to share with you is that we all need to be really on top of this issue. Right now, the system is being set up in the State Board of Elections. But what is important, we're monitoring to be sure it gets set up. Governor Hochul, interestingly enough, unlike Governor Cuomo, is a strong supporter of public financing of elections. Her people have said to me that she worked on public financing for the congressional races when she was a member of Congress. And she wants to be sure that this system is set up in a way that's workable. So we and our colleagues in the Fair Elections Coalition are looking very carefully at how it's being set up and working with the Board of Elections. But just as importantly, we need candidates to understand and the community to understand the benefit of this system. So there are going to be a lot of discussions in this upcoming 2022 legislative cycle in terms of, okay, this is the money you've raised, but if this system were in place, here's how it would change your ability to raise money. People need to be aware of it. And as that education campaign ramps up, we will definitely be coming back to the Council of Churches to offer the ability to explain to your congregants what's going on, the benefits of the system, and how they, as supporters of candidates, can actually help to implement the system and to be sure that it works by getting the small dollar donations the candidates want.
I always
So
tell people that
exciting progress.
you don't have to believe that politicians are crooked to be worried about somebody giving them $67,000, a single person. Human nature says, whose call am I going to return at the end of the day when I'm exhausted? You're going to call the big donor. So people are obliged to them, whether or not they think or say they are in fact obliged to respond to them. I saw in the paper just the other day, I forget what the special interest was, who was explaining that Governor Hochul had come to this private fundraiser, She was just out in public learning what people think. Well, that fundraiser cost $50,000 a table. That's not the public.
No, that is totally not the public. Yeah. And that's what this system helps to really change and refocus candidates, because part of this, what we learned with ranked choice voting in New York City, is the voter education is really a three-legged stool. Advocates will communicate with voters. The jurisdictions will communicate with voters. Board of Elections can send out information, but the candidates talking to voters is also a really important part of this. So we are really looking forward to working with candidates and educating candidates and the public to be sure that the system gets set up and is used.
Yeah, this is going to be an important place for all the folks on this call to be talking to your neighbors, your fellow parishioners, your coworkers, and helping to untangle the lies we've been told and the confusions that many people have because they haven't been close to this kind of an issue.
Exactly. So there will be opportunities for workshops and passing out information and updates over the next 2 years as we help the state build this system in a way that works for candidates and the public. And
yes,
it's actually
got your
workable.
hand up again. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just, I think that those of us in congregations, at least in my congregation at the Riverside Church in New York City, we're very interested in voting rights. And we've been very involved in federal voting right, protecting the federal. I don't think we're as engaged in, but we're beginning to talk about democracy starts at the local level. So could you give us a way of entering this work at the state level and at the local level? I really think that, I don't know, maybe there are other congregations that are much more involved at the state and local level, and we'd like to be doing more of that.
Well, Samadhi, we are really happy to set up informational sessions to come in. I mean, we actually co-sponsored a program with Riverside when we were working on voting rights for people on parole, where we brought in members of the affected community really to talk about why this was such an important reform. And we're happy to provide information, to do a workshop, to provide fact sheets, the priorities that are on the Council of Churches list, to talk about what Let New York Vote is doing to help, if there are congregants who are interested in becoming involved in talking to their legislative representatives, helping facilitate that, adding them into ongoing meetings. So for instance, right now, our colleagues at the Restore the Vote Coalition are setting up meetings with state legislators to talk about the need to provide full, never to remove citizen rights from any citizen, irrespective of their interaction with the carceral system. We want to add, voting rights advocates to help amplify that story and to follow the lead of the community that is, so negatively impacted. But also as we're bringing back the measures that are on the ballot to help people understand really what's at stake here, and to explain, frankly, do not assume that New York will remain a quote unquote progressive state. What we are seeing is a trend towards very blue cities and very red rest of the state. And we need to be much better messengers and defenders of democracy as we know it has to function as an inclusive, effective system than we are being. So we have a lot of information to share about how you talk about voting in a persuasive way and what the issues are. So delighted to work with, Riverside's various committees, because I know you've got a lot going on.
We have a lot.
And to figure out how we can be helpful in informing your congregation.
Thank you. Is there, we can just reach you at Common Cause New York.
Yes, I'll put my email in the chat.
And
Thank
there
you.
are also numerous websites listed in the ask on the Council of Churches website. So I tried to find a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different media outlets, and so there's well over a dozen in there. That would be a good place to start for anybody.
Absolutely. And, I would say go to the letnewyorkvote.org website. It is the statewide coalition that works on voting rights and expanding the ballot, not just, the voting rights for people who are incarcerated, but there's an important bill, which is the state version of the Voting Rights Act that would set up, that would make New York the first state to have a pre-clearance process, right? So that changes in our election procedures, redistricting, and other things which have an outsized impact on communities that are traditionally marginalized and underrepresented would have to go through a clearance process. So the website is letnyvote.org. And it is the hub for all of the grassroots activity around voting rights. And it's a coalition that has a strong grassroots component as well as an organizational component. So you can hook in organizationally, or you can hook in as a just an interested individual. We have ongoing briefings and discussions for our grassroots as well as our organizational partners about the priorities, many of which overlap with the Council of Churches priorities, I'm happy to say. And the Council of Churches is indeed a member of Let New York Vote.
Susan, in the 5 minutes we have left, I wonder if you could spend a brief amount of time talking about the LLCs and their role in campaign financing. This is something that was a mystery to me when I first moved back to New York. I said, what the heck's an LLC?
So, and it's an ongoing problem. We thought we'd put our fingers in the dike, but not quite. Limited liability corporation is a business structure that is being used increasingly by entities that, or individuals that don't want to have their identities revealed to the public. So it is a limited liability corporation, which does not have to reveal who are the owners. It is a vehicle which is used by, frankly, criminals from around the world to buy real estate in New York City so that they can launder money without it being obvious that the money is coming from Central Asia or other oligarchical states. It is also a vehicle which has been used particularly by the real estate companies to be able to avoid campaign contribution limits. And so a campaign contribution limit would apply individually to each LLC under prior law. But what we saw that literally there were real estate companies that have, and properly for good business reasons, a separate LLC for each and every building that they own. But they own over 100 buildings. So they would be able to maximize campaign contributions from each and every LLC and end up thwarting the campaign contribution limits, which are already sky high in New York, way too high. But they would be able to multiply it 10, 15, 20 times, really coming from the same source. So we were able to pass a law here in New York State, which says if there is enough overlap of ownership that the LLCs have to be aggregated for campaign limit purposes, and that there have to be disclosures as to who is actually the owners of the LLCs. But we've run into a problem. We passed the law. We were very happy to do that. It took years of really hard work, but there's no enforcement. So LLCs are really not revealing who the ownership is. It is a problem which has come up, frankly, in Governor Hochul's campaign.
Already, yes.
Already. And it is extraordinarily frustrating to have put in all of this effort to pass a law which is just being ignored by the contributors, by the candidates, because there is no enforcement. So we're starting to focus on the enforcement part of it. But it's really important to keep an eye on this, and frankly, to ask questions of the candidates you support, who are coming to your congregations to give presentations, to indicate, how the good policies that they support, and to ask them, do you follow the LLC law? Are you requiring your LLC donors to disclose ownership? What are you doing to be sure that this important law is being followed?
Thank you. We have a minute and a half left here. I just want to sign myself off by saying thank you all for being here. It gets late in the day sometimes, and after lunch, that's the hardest time to do a seminar. But you've all asked great questions. I want to thank Susan also for the depth and breadth of her understanding of all these many issues.
And delighted to be working with all of you, and so very happy that the Council of Churches is an active member of the coalition that is looking out for all voters. Looking forward to continuing this discussion with those of you who want to contact me directly. And Ronnie, I promise we will be in contact for sure.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, take care. And Samadhi, please.
Yes,
Let's
yes.
continue the discussion.
We do have a lot of committees. That's one of our problems.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. There's so many wonderful things happening here, pieces of information that are getting shared. One thing I wanted to mention is a program that we're supporting right now is called the Landlord Locator program, which helps us find landlords in New York City who would be willing to accept a voucher. And I'll put in the chat the contact. If you either are a landlord or have somebody in your congregation who's a landlord, or are familiar with vacancies that are in your community, to please be in touch with us. This is a very powerful way to, in a low-cost way, for you to make a difference in helping people find secure and stable housing. Mark Greenberg, do you have another minute, one more second here before we move out room?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Peter. So it's called calling it the Interfaith Landlord Locator Project, and there are 8,000 federally funded 10-year vouchers. They're not Section 8, which are normally 20 or 25, but they're 10-year guaranteed vouchers that the federal government has provided to the state through the CARES Act. And they're being administered, some of them through Interfaith enterprise community partners. And so Peter and I and other partners are looking to identify congregations who can help us identify potential landlords who'd be open to learning about accepting these vouchers.
Okay.
Very helpful for us. I'm putting in the chat the contact person, Drew Oldfield, with his
Okay.
email address. Just write to him and let him know.
Okay.
If you're interested, we can have further conversations.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Okay, Elizabeth, we're going to move on to our last session.